Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. It is Saturday, which means that I've just finished uploading all the content for this past week's development progress onto the conceptbay.net platform. This week I have once again managed to tap out all of my weekly upload quota. However, the majority of that was actually taken up by the Leadwerks object instancing tutorial, which you'll see me cover at the end of the video. But even with that in mind, I think we've managed to make a fair amount of progress across all of the projects. Let's take a look. For the RTAG Rise project, we've been mainly retracing our steps with the basic features of the game: controls, controller support, and inputs, as well as dialing in something that felt like the original gravities and jumping heights and walk speeds and run speeds that we had gotten used to in the GameMaker Studio version of the game. This time around, instead of using actions, I decided to try to read the controller inputs directly, which interestingly enough made the process of creating scalable control inputs across multiple characters fairly straightforward. I mainly used methods which directly sample the inputs from a certain device number, and all I had to do is just feed the player number into the device number, and suddenly player object number 2 was reading controller inputs from controller number 2, and player object number 4 was reading inputs from controller number 4. So the whole system is kind of a code once and forget it for all the other players. We set up some basic tiles and auto tile brushes, mainly brick and stone and concrete designs, which are very prominent throughout the very first act of the story campaign. I'm actually really glad that I've taken the time to figure out what would be the appropriate tile size this time around, because I have to say, having 64 by 64 pixel tile is so much more suitable for the amount of detail that I'm looking to put into the tile sets and graphics for this game. You will see me create the auto tile brush for the concrete walls that include all of the relevant side and corner pieces, junctions and connections. We'll end up experimenting a bit with the designs and patterns and end up getting what I can consider to be a pretty solid concrete tile map. Story-wise, the entire first chapter pretty much takes place in an underground bunker, so a lot of concrete, a lot of rusty metals, a lot of industrial blues and cold colors. The 64 pixel tile is already eons better whatever the heck I had in the previous rendition of this project. It is a lot closer to what I envisioned for the visual aesthetic of the game. And as you can see, with the smooth camera code and the nice player movement, I'd say it turned out satisfactory to what I'm looking for. At this point, we are so early in the migration of the project to the new engine that at this point I just pick any random feature from the original and start recreating it. And in this episode, what I decided to concentrate on is camera movement, local co-op mechanics, and the death screen. So starting with the camera in this game is a little bit more complex than just toggling the smooth keyword on the camera properties in the inspector. The camera has to figure out the two furthest players away from one another and then stay in the perfect in-between position between those two furthest players. Generally speaking, if you pick the two furthest players, then you will logically be encompassing all of the players in the game, because the two furthest players will have the other two players sitting in between them. I had to program some additional movement code for the camera object in order to really smooth down that motion. The properties I get in the inspector weren't quite getting the right result, although they are a part of the final equation. We had also taken time to program the spawn points object. This is an object that you can drop into a level and indicate where each of the 4 players are going to appear in the level. This allows me to actually create levels which segregate players into separate categories, and then we can have some interesting co-op mechanics where players have to flip switches for one another. Of course, in this case, I would have to devise a system that makes sure that you don't get co-op levels if you're only playing by yourself. The co-op levels will only become available if you are playing with 1, 2, or 3 other players besides yourself. The death screen user interface system is also something that I have handled in this episode. The system actually scales itself based on the size of the window, regardless if you're playing in full screen or windowed mode. And the way the death screen works in single player is a little bit different from co-op. The benefit of playing the game in co-op is that you have a chance of saving another player when they get hurt. As you can see, what happens when the player falls into the spikes is that he turns into the quote-unquote hurt icon, which is something I have yet to animate or make at least somewhat appealing. But the basic idea is that after you hurt yourself, there's a small window of opportunity for another player to save you. All they have to do is track their way close enough to you in order to click on the revive button, and then the player who got hurt is going to be teleported to their savior. After this, the revived player has to make sure they stay out of harm's way for the next little bit until the cooldown timer runs out. Otherwise, if they get hurt immediately after, the whole team gets penalized by getting killed and having to start back at the spawn point. And to wrap up the week for this particular project, I decided to also handle the slip block. The slip block is essentially a single tile or a single block object which prevents the players from being able to jump off of it, so you cannot wall jump off of these slip blocks. We have used this particular block pretty religiously in the previous rendition of the game, where it provided us with some interesting level traversal limitations which the players had to either creatively or skillfully overcome. Right now, I have to say this is probably the easiest part of the development because all of the mechanics that exist here, I have already coded once in GameMaker Studio, and honestly, just because this is Godot engine doesn't mean that the code is really going to vary that much. The rotation is still the same, the behavior is the same, the timing is the same. Heck, I could have even used the same exact sprites, but to be honest, since I've created these sprites, my artistic skills have improved enough for me to see a lot of the flaws in the old sprite work, so I'm actually remaking quite a lot of the visual assets as well. Now, going back to the slip blocks, an interesting addition that I've done here this time around is I've actually made the light up slip blocks, something that wasn't actually present in the original game. I think with a very bright light up slip block, I will be able to direct the players throughout the level in the complex environments. And up until this point, the only one we've been using is pretty much the flat slip block with no light elements, which you see on the left. Just the flat color delimited by a darker palette, which tells you that that block cannot be jumped off of. That is it for the progress on RTAG Rise for this week. I would have made a lot more progress, however, as I said, a part of my week has been taken by the creation of the Leadwerks instancing tutorial. So whenever I create one of those specialized tutorials, it's going to eat into my development time for the games. But, you know, it's content, it's educational material, and it brings value to the platform, so it's worth putting my time into these things. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next project. Okay, see if you can recall this feeling for a second. You're in school, you're in class, you're doing a test. The bell rings, and it's the end of the test. All the people are getting up, all the people are submitting your papers, and you're sitting there writing the last few sentences of your essay. I am talking about that tingly feeling of anxiety that you get as you write the last few sentences before you know the thing is done, and you can finally put it behind you and move on with your life to new affairs. That is basically the feeling I'm getting from the Dream Team Theater project right about now. We are so close to getting a minimum viable product, just the minimum game that can be played. No need for textures, no need for pretty effects, just the minimum that you can launch and play. Since the last week when we've handled the loot crate deployment mechanic, the next logical step would be the contents of the loot crate, which means that we can now work on guns, weapons, and related mechanics. And before we can do that, I have to address a glaring problem. Right now, I don't have a multi-rig hand system, which is what this particular test in front of you was for. This tiny little shitty gun and a shitty hand. This was a test of me trying to figure out how to get multiple rigs into Godot engine. You see, right now the weapon you've seen me create, the rotary wind-up weapon, that weapon currently has its very own set of hands, which is not exactly a good way to go about it in FPS games. You're not supposed to have a gun and each gun has its own set of hands. You're supposed to try to reuse the same hands you have, and essentially what you have in the game is a single set of hands. That object has all the animations for all the weapons, and then all you have to do is just swap out the weapon objects with their own rigs and play their animations together. All it is just taking the hands, playing a certain animation on the hands, and then synchronizing the animation of the weapon with the animation of the hands. That will basically make it look like it's one same rig. I have not been able to figure it out, but mainly because of the nightmare I had to go through with Godot Engine's 3D model importing. Before, there were some weird artifacts either caused by Blender or Godot Importer, and just the thing would not work. But now that we're at the point where I need to start populating the game with guns and variety and basic mechanics, it's time to figure out the multi-rig system. And I did. The multi-rig system is actually a pretty straightforward process, but it requires a little bit of knowledge of Blender's scene system and the collection system in order to export the objects properly. Also, a big mistake that I made before that I'm kind of sad that it didn't work is trying to use Blender's linked assets in my workflow. The basic idea is that with Blender's linked assets, you can make a pair of hands fully rigged, fully set up, fully weight painted and textured, and then all you have to do is import external Blender projects for weapons into the project with the hands, and then what you get are linked projects, which means that if you go into the project of the weapon and modify it, those modifications show up in the project with the hands. That didn't work. It refused to export, and it's kind of sad because that would be the best scenario for creating weapons and creating animations and synchronizing all of your changes across multiple projects. Since it didn't work, I have to have a single project with a type of weapon, with a set of hands, and all of the weapons and hands and animations would have to be stored in one single project. At least maybe until I somehow figure out how to get linked projects up and running properly. Proxies don't seem to work, so that's just sucks. However, now that I have taken time to create some sort of a placeholder gun and a pair of hands in Blender, I did manage to export the hands separately and the weapon separately, and then fusing them together in Godot and essentially getting a one single functioning first-person shooter hands object. I also have to create an all-new hand rig, mainly because the hand rig I've been using up until this point actually has a problem with its wrist. The wrists are wrapping like candy wrappers, and they're just collapsing when you twist the wrist in a certain way. And I did also figure out how to fix that problem with a certain method of subdividing and weight painting for the bones. So that has to happen. I have to re-rig the set of hands in order to get them behaving properly, maybe even adjust the model a little bit, but this is not, I would say, a bad hand model. It does need to be worked on it a little bit, but other than that, I don't really need to model a whole new set of hands from scratch. The rig, however, has to go through a few modifications. Having figured out the multi-rig system, I moved on to addressing one of the biggest problems I have yet to address in this game. How do I handle the creation of guns? I have taken on the monumentally ridiculous task of using Borderlands weapon RPG system as a template for the way I would like to handle weapons in the game. Characters and enemies drop weapons, loot crates have a lot of weapon choices, there's a storefront that offers weapons. I have to make a lot of weapons, which is why what I thought might be a good idea to take the modular weapon generation approach. I'm not sure how the Borderlands developers handle their weapons. They do use some sort of a modular system because they are not shy about how many weapons their game offers. So the way I thought about it is if I give it an experiment, I can divide my weapons into 3 sections: the front bit, the back bit, and the handle. I'm not a gun nut, I don't know what these things are called, but I want to make a game. So, the front bit, the back bit, and the handle, or the grip, whatever you want to call it, we have 3 components. Now, with the 3 components together, what I could do is I could create 6 designs for the grip, 6 designs for the back piece, and the 6 designs for the front piece, or I guess that would be the barrel. Now think of it this way, I have 6 handles and I have 6 back pieces, which means that I now have 36 combinations of weapons in total. And then I have also 6 designs of the front piece, which means that now I have 216 variations of the weapons. I can create any sort of combination from these 6 barrels, 6 back pieces, and 6 grips, and I will create a total of 216 different guns. Now, check this out. What if also I have 6 textures for each of the pieces? We went from 216 weapon designs to 1296 weapon designs. 6 textures, 6 grips, 6 back pieces, and 6 barrels. This is a game of exponential gains. So let's say I create 20 designs for the grips, 20 designs for the back piece, 20 designs for the front piece, the barrel, and then 20 textures. I get a total of 160,000 weapon combinations. So this is how Borderlands gets their weapon combinations, and the thing is, they have the manpower to get a lot of these variations and designs for multiple weapons. I'm currently dealing with creating just the pistol. I still have to do other weapon types like SMGs and assault rifles. All of that sort of stuff has to be probably modular if I want to achieve the same sort of dynamic loot crate with dynamic stats and dynamic weapon designs system. So I don't have to design each and every weapon meticulously from scratch. I don't have the manpower to do that. If I try to do that, I'm gonna be 90 years old sitting here working in Blender. Hey guys, I finished it. I got it. Guys, hello? We stand on the shoulders of giants, and I am having a hell of a time keeping up with these sort of demands, but if I do get to pull this off, I think the results might be kind of fun. After we figure out the dynamic weapon system, the only thing that we'll have to do is generate those weapons randomly with random stats in the loot crates. We will also have to set up the shop and the shopkeeper animations. I already have the voice lines recorded for the character, and I am currently awaiting for the voice work to come in for the host character as well. Once that is in, we can implement it into the game and form our waves hordes mechanic, and the only thing that will be left to do at that point is probably the one part that I've been looking forward to do ever since I started game development, is music. I got into game development because I wanted to write music for games that wouldn't get cancelled or shelved or forgotten. And lo and behold, over 6 years later, I'm still waiting to write music for the games that wouldn't get shelved or forgotten or abandoned. God damn it, this shit is difficult. You gotta deal with making an income, keeping up your health, making sure that you stay off burnout and depression. It is a tough business to make a project happen from start to finish, especially when you plague yourself with games of super large scope. Nevertheless, I think I've been making some pretty good progress across all the projects, and as a reminder, the reason why I work on multiple projects is actually to deal with staving off burnout. Whenever I feel like I'm running out of ideas and I'm just running on fumes for one project, that's when I switch to another and work there. Because these projects are totally different, so they address different parts of game development and they work with different ideas. So, the creation of various patterns for the weapons was where we left off for the Dream Team Theater project. You can check all of these projects out on the Concept Bay platform, and let's move on to the next project. In Accursed Kingdom, our production took mostly around the user interface and the inventory system. Now, I have had enough of the grid-based inventory, which I've been pretty much implemented into most of my games, and I decided to go for the Skyrim-style list system. I played a little bit with the theme and the general aesthetic for the sort of an inventory ornament I want to have in the menus. Mainly it's kind of turning out a little bit Victorian with all the squiggly ironwork, so to speak. I didn't really go too much into shading, just the general shapes and outlines and the general idea of how I would go about handling the generation of the menu. The whole menu system is basically made out of individual components which scale themselves in the corners depending on the size of the contents. The more I work on this project, the more I feel like I might start using more Victorian-era designs to influence the general aesthetic of the architecture and the contents of the game, including the user interface. So, even though I often talk about Dark Souls being the source of inspiration for the way I want to handle the feel of the combat in the game, the general aesthetic I feel might actually borrow more from Bloodborne than the Dark Souls series. I've spent most of the time experimenting with what I want my inventory system to look, and the direction in which my experiments have led me to, I would probably consider to be pretty suitable for the general style and aesthetic of the game. The final result for the progress we've made this week for the interface, I would say, is actually pretty good. Now, the fact that the interface items kind of pop out of the interface borders, I am actually not all that iffy about. I feel like if I'm gonna go with a list-style interface, I want to make sure that as much of the interface items are visible on the screen without having to turn it into a grid. And don't get me wrong, I have contemplated quite a bit on whether I should go with a grid-style or list-style interface, and the thing is that with the grid-style interface, I can basically have one inventory and everything gets bulked into one single inventory like with Minecraft, or with Dark Souls, you have a grid-style interface, but you also have the tabs that organize different items, and the thing is that once you have the tabs, not all of the inventory is visible in front of you. So the benefit of using a grid is that everything is always in front of you at all times. You can quickly glance and notice the icon you're looking for and just dart to it and pick up the item you need. When you introduce tabs with a grid style interface, then you are no longer aware of all the things that are available to you, which is also something that you end up getting with the list style interface. So I figured if we're gonna have a lot of items in the game and they will need to be stored somewhere and you're never gonna be able to see all of them, I might as well go with the list style interface and tackle the mechanic of limiting how much stuff you can actually carry using a carry weight system, where your character has only a certain amount of items they can carry, kind of like in Fallout and Skyrim, and each item in the inventory has a certain weight to it. In which case, in order to be able to carry more, you will have to upgrade your strength stats, which probably can be only done via getting some sort of experience points currency, kind of like when you have souls in Dark Souls and Bloodborne. Now, the week was definitely not all about user interface, because I have also tackled the AI pathfinding system into the characters. And we also can receive damage. You can see there's quite a bit of camera wobble, and the camera wobble is supposed to be relatively disorienting, where getting hit is usually something that you are really supposed to be dreadful of. Because if you do get killed, you start at the beginning of the level of the last checkpoint, another mechanic borrowed from the Dark Souls franchise. I feel like that mechanic really capitalizes on the dangers of being too rash and too quick, and whenever I play Dark Souls, at least from my personal experience, I have to be super careful and wary of what's behind the next corner. That mechanic really capitalizes on you being careful, and now paired up with the co-op system when you play with your friend, I feel like this is gonna really bring the friendship and bring the player cooperation together, survive together, heal together, fight together, and be super careful, because there is evil lurking in the shadows, and if one player dies, the survival rate of the other player drastically lowers, and you are at risk of losing all your progress and trailing back to the last checkpoint. Again, this is the point when I start contemplating about the minimum viable product. We are handling our inventory, we're handling the enemies attacking the player. This is starting to look like something you can play. This is the progress we've made on the Accursed Kingdom game. I'm looking forward to working more on the level design and implementing some enemy AI, setting up some jump scares and tough, scary enemies. But for now, let's move on to the next project. I believe the Child of Ether has pretty much gotten the benefit of the most progress this week. I have gotten the system to save and load all of the nodes for the quests placed in this editor, as well as started working on a dedicated toolbar for creating journal entries for quest tasks, as well as creating quest items, which are essentially little markers that tell the game that you've completed certain quests. Each quest will have a certain set of markers, and the system that I'm programming allows other quests to add markers for one another. So completing a quest on one part of the map may as well also satisfy a certain criteria or task for another quest. One practical application of this is to make some quests linear, meaning that not all of the quests for the entire world are available to you right away. You have to complete certain quests in order for other quests to be unlocked. For example, the primary use for this is for story progression, making sure that the linear story, the main quest, so to speak, that the character is supposed to experience, is indeed experienced in the correct chronological order. Right now, as of this moment, the tool supports creating quest items, or otherwise known as quest markers in this case. I might actually rename the tool to be called that. That seems to make more sense. You can save quest markers, and they also get saved to your local hard drive, so whenever you load the game back up, those markers are already present. Same thing goes for the task entries for your journal. These tasks are supposed to pop up whenever you get a new task for a quest, or whenever you complete a task and the next task is assigned. I'm actually starting to think of the system more as just a character dialogue builder which has the quest building system capabilities, because I can create simple dialogues here without necessarily having them start up quests. That's the sort of foresight I'm trying to put into development of this tool. I can create secret quests. Secret quests that don't have an official tabloid, but the ones that can assign tasks and check for criteria upon completion nonetheless. This is something that I really loved about the Fallout series, is that quests don't necessarily have to have an official tabloid. And just when I thought I had completed just about any quest in the world, I talked to some merchant or I talked to some villager, and they have just a simple little task for me to fetch an item or go explore to some place, which ends up making me discover something interesting. The more I work on this tool, the more I realize just how story heavy this particular project is going to be. So I'm trying my best to occupy my free time with anything to do about educating myself on the principles of storytelling. As I said before, I am probably not going to be revolutionizing the game development industry, so I have to play to my strengths, and keeping the engagement with the player with a compelling and riveting story is the sure way to go in my case. So as of this moment, we have programmed the quest system, the ability to save and load quests, as well as create connection nodes which trail different dialogues and player responses, and various player responses are capable of spawning new dialogue subjects or revealing additional information. And because of the way the modular quest building system is built, at any point in time, the player's choice in dialogue responses can result in certain rewards or certain tasks being fulfilled or certain quests being assigned, and this makes up for a pretty wide variety of experiences that I can build using this tool and players' interaction with the characters. Now, a large portion of what you see in front of you with this particular interface was actually achieved by an extensive chunk of code which dynamically generates user interface nodes and items which allow me to quickly spawn any amount of items, save them to the hard drive, recall them at any time for any volumes, any amounts, and the whole system is scalable. I can create giant quests filled with many rewards and many items and many dialogue faucets and many different choices and outcomes. This is all made possible because of the Godot's graphical user interface library. This library has pretty much handled, I would say, 80% of what I would end up be doing by myself in a different engine like GameMaker Studio. I can create buttons and connection nodes and text inputs and drop-down menus. These things have sped up the development of this tool quite significantly. I don't have to worry about generating and creating and designing my own option boxes. I can simply use the node to get the job done and move on to getting the whole contraption together. Now, we are getting pretty close to getting this thing up and running. I'm sure we're going to be adding and expanding the functionality of it quite a bit, but for now, as long as I can walk up to characters and trigger dialogues, and them having to assign a quest that pops up in the journal and a task that pops up below the quest, I will be happy. Last but not least, a major part of the quest building system is the ability to receive rewards. As a matter of fact, it's a huge part of the entire game as a whole. Being able to scavenge various containers and barrels and boxes for randomly generated loot will probably imply that I need to have some sort of a central library or dictionary or storage of all the items that exist in the game. And having that be created from within the project allows me to also attach it not only in the game for random generation, but also in the quest building system for simply adding a item grant node and selecting which item I'm supposed to grant, and then picking from the list of options the properties of the item that the player is supposed to receive. So in the last episode for this project, I have started assembling the library of the items and various properties that each item is capable of having. In this particular case, we've been working on the potions, brews, and tonics, which are basically all one single item, simply separated by the properties and effects that they offer to the player. This concludes all the progress we've made for the Child of Ether project this week, so let's move on and take a look at the last bit of content made available this week on the Concept Bay platform. I'm sure that many people decided to skip on the trailer for this video when I released it, mainly because it involves around the engine that they're probably not using. The engine in question is, of course, the Leadwerks engine. It is an engine that, like any other engine, allows you to program in multiple programming languages, mainly the C++ and Lua, and its Lua programming is basically akin to the Godot engine's GD script programming. It's basically a simple to understand, simple to work with, simple to attach and manipulate the object with interpreted programming language. Now, in my case, I have opted in to use C++ programming alongside with this engine in a false assumption that C++ programming would allow me more open doors in terms of what kind of games I could make with the engine. But now, in hindsight 2020, to be honest, with the C++ programming language, you mainly get the benefits of speed and performance, which, to be honest, you have to be working on some pretty heavy games in order to even start feeling the difference. From my experience with different engines, I found that in the indie scene, there are two types of developers. There are game developers and there are programmers. The programmers are the experienced college or university graduates or extremely passionate scholars who make it their mission to comprehend the language in its full glory. And the other type are game developers. These are people whose end goal is to create a game, is to realize some sort of a project. These people are the jacks of all trades. They may not know the depths of a single programming language, but they can take a project from start to finish and deliver a quality product by utilizing all of their available skills. Provided they don't pick a project too far out of scope for a single-man developer, these people make games happen. And for these people, knowing all the ins and outs of a programming language is not necessary. Their game projects are not so huge in scope as to require fine-tuned granular control that languages like C++ offer. And in my case, I end up struggling more with C++ than actually getting anything done. And getting things done is my top priority. I want to make beautiful games, I want to write really cool stories, I want to make a playable experience, and many of these things are achieved with skills that are not programming. Skills like painting, animation, rigging, modeling, texturing. Even the model you see in front of you, most of this work is not programming. In fact, there's actually very little programming involved in this particular exercise. Granted, what little programming there is, I would have achieved in a different engine with a different programming language, or maybe even in the same engine using Lua than using C++. But of course, that all comes down to my experience and exposure with the engine. As with the other engines I've experimented with, the more I work in it, the more exposure I get, the more projects I build my experience up with, the easier it is for me to create things like this. And it doesn't help that C++ is not exactly a beginner-friendly language. Many of the interpreted languages out there, like BASIC with AppGameKit, GDScript with Godot, GML with GameMaker Studio, all of these languages basically handle a huge part of data management for you. They convert variables, they move around data, they deal with memory and garbage collection. All of these things detract you, the game developer, from making any reasonable progress with the completion of your game. Now, nonetheless, the reason why I dabble with C++ and Leadwerks is because, well, I think it might be good experience, and the whole process is totally new. It's a completely different method of addressing the code base for your game and handling the creation of objects and handling the logic of enemies and players and characters and world environments. There's also a huge lack of documentation and educational content for the C++ in conjunction with Leadwerks in the subject of game development side, which means, if I figure it out, I can share it and more value for the platform. And that's precisely what this particular series was all about. It was about the process of creation for these props, texturing, and programming, how to create objects and instance them in the game, trigger the animations by interacting with the various components of the prop. It will also serve as a self-education study, as every time I return to Leadwerks, I end up having to reteach myself all of the things that I didn't spend enough time to really solidify in my memory. So now that I have that video content, it's permanently on the platform, and if I forget, I can always go there and remind myself how it is done. Now, if you're interested in getting a hold of all the videos, all the production content, go to the conceptbay.net platform and sign up for the monthly membership. This way you can support my game development progress and get access to all of the uncut production videos that I record as I am working on these games. Every minute of every hour documented and recorded on the platform for all of my projects available to you. So if you're looking to support this channel, that is the best way to do it. That is better than the Patreon. You actually get something of value out of it in return. Thank you so much for watching this content report video. I really appreciate your time. I will see you in the next video next Saturday during the next content report. Adios.